In October 1957, there was a total solar eclipse. The winner of the Miss World competition was, for the first time ever, a woman from Finland. The motto, "In God We Trust," appeared for the very first time on United States paper currency. But there was also another first, an event of huge historical significance, which some people see as the true beginning of the space race. This was the launch of the first man-made object to orbit Earth. On the 4th of October 1957, Sputnik 1 became the first artificial Earth satellite in the history of mankind. My name is Alex Deva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was certainly not easy to convince that a satellite was high on its list of priorities. It took, in fact, Sergei Korolev more than 4 years to get it approved, and he had to wait until he had the rocket that could launch it. By 1954, the R-7 rocket was able of carrying about 5 tons worth of atomic bomb. So he judged that a smaller satellite, say a ton and a half, wouldn't be much of a technical challenge to lift into low orbit. So he proposed the idea to the Minister of Armaments, but he had to do it in a particularly diplomatic and roundabout way. In fact, he suggested the satellite launch as a test of the ICBM missiles. 2 years later, in 1956, the Communist Party finally agreed to allow work to begin on the world's first artificial satellite. In that same year, Korolev was put in charge of the Special Design Bureau No. 1. Unlike NASA, which has always been one single organization dedicated to the American space exploration effort, there hasn't been one single similar organization in the Soviet Union. Instead, the work was done by a number of bureaus, institutions and groups which often were poorly coordinated and even competing against each other. The job of creating humanity's first artificial satellite was divided among no fewer than 6 different institutions. Among them, Korolev's Special Design Bureau was tasked with building the satellite. Other institutions received different bits of the project. The Ministry of Radiotechnical Industry, for example, was going to create the telemetry and radio communication systems. The Ministry of Shipbuilding would create the gyroscopes, and the Ministry of Defense would conduct the rocket launches, and so on. Stalin had died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev became the new leader of the Soviet Union. This was a man who loved nothing more than to brag about the Soviet Union's superiority on the United States. Korolev saw that and tapped into that weakness. Every time he wanted to do something, he used the angle that, if he didn't, then the Americans might just do it first. In fact, the Eisenhower administration had actually announced 1 year earlier that they were going to launch an object called Vanguard into the orbit. But the communist decision-makers were unimpressed by that announcement. Time was therefore running low, and even after the party finally gave the project the green light, things still weren't moving fast enough. In keeping with tradition, the Soviet Academy of Sciences had created a committee led by one of Korolev's friends, named Mstislav Keldysh. In an exasperated attempt to get some momentum, Keldysh held a presentation in front of the presidium of the Academy, trying to sell the idea of a satellite. He did that by dangling in front of them all the possible pioneering advances that the satellite would bring, such as measuring the Earth's magnetic fields, investigating the upper atmosphere, the radiation of the sun, and lots of others. But it wasn't until he pronounced one word that he caught everyone's attention. And that word was dog. Keldysh told them that, according to biologists, the way dogs experience things is quite close to humans, so placing a dog inside a box orbiting the Earth of 8,000 meters a second might be kind of a cool thing to do. And so work finally began in earnest. All the instruments required to do all the things that Keldysh had listed in his speech were brought together, or as the case was, invented. Altogether they weighed over 1 ton. The R-7 rocket would certainly be capable of lifting it, but there was huge complexity involved in managing all those devices, in making them reliable enough to begin with, and in figuring out how to send their data back to Earth. On top of it all, everything had to be done fast enough to still allow a chance to win against the Americans. The launch was delayed month after month, until Korolev made one of his famous executive decisions. The big 1-ton collection of instruments would be launched later, and indeed it became Sputnik 3 to be launched in 1958. But for the moment, the very simplest satellite possible would need to be created and launched now. So in only 1 month, and for only one reason, to be the first, they built something literally called the simplest satellite. The Russian word Sputnik means natural satellite. The moon, for instance, is a Sputnik in Russian, and so are Leda, Phoebe or Larissa, which orbit Jupiter, Saturn and Neptune respectively. Sputnik is an older word made by combining the prefix s, meaning together with, and Putnik, which means traveler. Together, Sputnik means fellow traveler or companion. Since this is what a satellite is, that meaning is appropriate. The full name, of course, of man's first artificial satellite was Sputnik 1, with 1 meaning 1. So this first man-made object to orbit our planet is literally called Satellite 1, translated to English. Most of the Western world assume that Sputnik is actually a name, but it isn't. Of all the thousands of satellites that have ever been launched, Sputnik 1 was probably the most recognizable. That's not just because it was famous, but also because it was so simple. It was a sphere of shiny metal, 58 centimeters in diameter, with 4 long radio antennas. It had a shell built of an aluminium-magnesium alloy, 2 millimeters thick, making 2 hemispheres that joined together with 36 bolts. Each antenna was almost 3 meters long. Weighing just under 84 kilograms, more than half of that was the power supply, which consisted of 3 batteries, 1 for the temperature control and 2 for the radio. Korolev's intention was to send this contraption to orbit on top of a rocket that had failed in 5 of its first 6 attempts to launch. It was not an easy month. All the satellite ever did while flying above the Earth was to transmit a series of beeps on 2 radio frequencies. This is what they sounded like. Each beep was about 1/3 of a second long, but if the inside temperature of the satellite were to exceed 50 degrees Celsius, a small device would cause the duration of the beeps to change, and so the people listening would know about it. There was also a pressure sensor inside, which would again cause the beeps to change duration in case the pressure suddenly decreased. This might have happened if the satellite had been, for example, punctured by a meteor. These beeps were sent on 2 radio frequencies that were easy to listen to by anyone on Earth with a decent radio. Thousands of radio amateurs, whose equipment was more than adequate for the job, were able to listen to the Soviets' emissary in space. The ball had also been polished almost to a mirror, and this for 2 reasons. 1, so that it would reflect as much as possible of the sun's heat, and 2, so that it would be visible from the ground using an average telescope. The trajectory that the satellite would follow was a very important factor, and calculating it was by no means easy. In another feat of Stalinist thinking, until the early 50s it was considered bourgeois to use computers. They were seen as, in the words of scientist Oleg Ivanovsky, false science. But the Academy of Sciences, having convinced the communist leadership of its importance, had started working on a computer called MESM, which was short for Small Electronic Counting Machine in Russian. This was the mother of all misnomers, since the computer occupied several rooms and required its own power station. 3 years later, it was followed by an improved version called BESM, which now stood for Fast Electronic Counting Machine. Cosmonaut Georgy Grechko, who started as a computer engineer, recalls calculating the orbit for Sputnik 1. The first part was difficult enough, but still could have been achieved by hand, even though it involved things like multiplying numbers having 6 digits each. Grechko employed the help of 2 young women who were working on the same calculations individually and comparing their results. They worked for several weeks, every day from 9 to 5, doing large number arithmetic. Later, though, things became so complicated that BESM, the only computer of the time, had to be used. Because it was the only one, it was also in great demand. Using it during daytime was assigned to the people who calculated trajectories for nuclear weapons, and the night belonged to Korolev. All the rest of the Soviet industry had maybe the use of 5 minutes a day. The launch took place in the morning of October the 5th, 1957. The R-7 rocket was carefully taken out, and Korolev, together with all the other chief designers, walked next to it in perfect silence the entire distance of 1.5 kilometers to the launch pad. The launch went well enough. The separation happened about 5 minutes later, and soon, to the immeasurable relief of the team on the ground, the famous beeps started coming through the radio speakers. The batteries in the satellite had been expected to last for 2 weeks, but in fact lasted more than 3, which was more than enough for the propaganda machine to exploit them to the max. However, amazingly, the Soviet press in the first day after the launch was incredibly subdued. The newspaper Pravda only gave it a few paragraphs and did not even mention the word Sputnik in the title. The story was limited to some technical details and some Soviet propaganda. Not the same in the next day's Pravda. Almost all of page 1 was dedicated to the event, with the huge title, "World's First Artificial Satellite of Earth Created in Soviet Nation." But rather than naming the principles in the story, because they were top secret, the article focused on the congratulations messages received from the main Cold War competitor, the United States. Reactions quickly landed in from Poland, China, Austria, Italy, the United Kingdom, and then again from New York, where an unusually huge headline said, "Russians won the competition." It was almost inconceivable to the Americans that they had lost. To them, the Soviet Union was a country ravaged by the loss of tens of millions of people in the war, and then further demolished by communism and Stalinism, facing nothing but hunger and ruin. That such a nation would be capable of winning in front of the Americans was an incredibly difficult pill to swallow. Even worse was it to those people who knew and understood just how far behind the Americans actually were at the time. In 1957, all the United States could hope for was to launch a tiny satellite the size of a small watermelon, and they couldn't even do that for a while. It was no surprise then that the Americans felt inferior and exposed. Inferior because they were unable to match the Soviets' achievements, but exposed because the Soviet rockets, if clearly able to put a satellite in orbit, would obviously be able to rain down atomic bombs on the US at speeds and from altitudes which made them impossible to defend against. Lyndon Johnson, who wasn't yet president at the time, compared the Russians throwing down bombs from space with kids throwing rocks at passing cars from an overpass. The famous writer Arthur C. Clarke declared, quote, "The day Sputnik began orbiting the planet was the day the United States became a second-rate power." In the same vein, the American Senator Henry Jackson proclaimed in disgust that the government should declare a national week of shame and danger.
Когда Джон Кеннеди спросил
One of the later directors of a Russian space organization, Vakhtang Dmitrievich Vakhnadze, told the story that when President Kennedy asked von Braun why the United States were behind in the space race, von Braun answered,
что у нас не было своего Королёва.
"Because we don't have our own Korolev." Launching the first artificial satellite in the history of humankind was a huge milestone in the history of our species. The impact of the event was immense, and trying to ride the wave of popularity, Khrushchev went to Korolev and demanded even more. Join me in the next episode to hear about another Soviet first, sending the first animal to space. This has been an episode of the Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.